There are a lot of agronomists in the situation at the moment don't know the head protection, whether they should go out and spray mace or not at this stage.
I think if you've got, part of it's going to depend on what inoculum you have got just underneath those heads. So we know we haven't got as much humidity to power the disease, but if you've lost control of the disease underneath, the one thing that we know is that we've got potential for a lot of inoculum. This is an SVS rating. Now, one of the things you have to be a little careful of is that sometimes they say that the ratings that cultivars get does not necessarily relate to the head infections. In other words, if something was resistant on the foliage, it may not mean that it's resistant to stripe rust in the head. But if you had a high level of fungus and inoculum underneath those heads, you'd have to say that there's a strong probability that we will pick up some head infection with a very susceptible cultivar. Where it's less susceptible and you have much less inoculum feeding from the base, then I'd have to say that everything about this spring strikes me as non-fungicide weather. But this is just so susceptible. I think you need to be mindful of how much you've got in the foliage when making that decision. If you've not controlled it well in the foliage, then there's still the probability of getting head infection. One of the things that I'd like, that we didn't actually finish off by saying, is I asked you if you could find stripe rust in the head. And at this stage, you can't, because it's still very early days. If you could have found it, we would not be able to control it. So they talk about controlling stripe rust in the head, you can't control it. They're absolutely right. But if you make the statement you cannot control stripe rust infection in the head, that's the wrong statement. There's a play on words, I know, but broadly speaking, if you sprayed these heads when they emerge, you will control the infection.
So if you sprayed it now that it's emerged,
yeah, you're
wasting your time.
You're in a no man's land, because this crop's been, these heads have been out a while. If you looked at that Yitpi over there, if that Yitpi was this mace, then I'd say that that crop over there is starting to get to the exact growth stage that you'd say, if I want to control stripe rust in the head, I need to do it. This crop, I think, is getting very marginal.
This is the predicament that's probably ahead of a few people out there at the moment, Nick, and it's whether they spray or not to spray, I suppose.
Yeah. So is the rule of thumb there, Nick, is if your head's out, pretty much you're not unlikely to get a benefit from the fungicide.
Well, I suppose it needs to be an economic return.
Economic returns, if you went back to good old Gordon Murray's indicator of how much yield you can hope to retrieve from fungicides at different timings, if you go back to his ratings, and Rob Wheeler put these figures up only yesterday, I think his mid-flower spray with a very susceptible cultivar was something like 12%.
Yep.
So I think that actually if you look at some of these heads, I would say that we're getting pretty much towards at least mid-flower, if not a bit later. You also know that underneath these crops they're already starting to senesce from the base, and I'd say that if you're looking at your yield profit and actually looking at how much moisture you've got available to the crop, that's his bigger part of the decision you're making, particularly if you're making it this late, not at that stage.
How much is available, Tim or Craigie?
There'll be 50 mils still here. There was a big rain here over the summer, so there's still a good amount of moisture, but it's certainly getting into that stress zone where it has to work a bit harder to get that moisture.
Yeah.
So that's just to further explain that one, you can't control stripe rust when it's in the head, but you can control stripe rust head infection by spraying the head before you get the infection.